Technology is everywhere these days, isn't it? And increasingly, it's been leveraged by businesses to get ahead and maintain that competitive advantage. And really, it's about time you updated yours. But you've had your procurement tech for years. It's like a trusted old workhorse. Okay, it's not as good as sleek, thoroughbred tech solutions, but it's served you well. Colleagues and suppliers are familiar with it, and they accept the shortcomings. And when you think about implementing a new tech solution, all those headlines charting failure after failure spring to mind. Oh, do you know, the status quo suddenly feels all right again, doesn't it? And there's no way you're going to set yourself up to fail, and you can't think of a way to avoid that risk that you will. That's why at Procurious, we've been working with Matt Stewart and the team at the Risedale Supply Chain Management Consulting firm to bring you all the advice you need to make your tech implementation a success. And in today's webinar, we're going to focus on the end goal of completed implementation, that tech win, and what it takes to really make things a success. Hello, I'm Helen McKenzie, Principal Advisor at Procurious and your host for the webinar today. Joining me are three guests with a wide range of tech implementation experience to share with you what works and, as important, what doesn't in the tech implementation space. Our first guest is Joe Walsh, CEO of Supply Chain Sherpas. Joe served in supply chain and business development roles for Corporate Express and Foodbuy. Joe served as Intermountain Healthcare's Chief Supply Chain Officer until late 2016, building an extraordinary talent bench and ultimately helping the team become Gartner's #1 ranked healthcare supply chain. Joe also served as Pensiomo's EVP of Operations as he helped to commercialize UPMC's supply chain ops. In 2018, Joe founded Supply Chain Sherpas with a clear mission: unlock the potential of our bottleneck supply chain to increase impact for suppliers and providers. Joe brings his unique 20-year track record of leading both supply chain transformations and commercial ventures across 3 industries to our webinar today. Welcome to the webinar, Joe.
Thank you, Helen. It's great to be with you today.
Okay, Joe, to get our listeners in the mood, could you share with us a great outcome from one of the tech implementations you've been involved in?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and especially in the interest of what we're talking about today, I'm gonna go back to my days at Intermountain Healthcare, where we implemented ERP, so quite a large implementation. It was a coordinated effort that had extraordinary executive leadership support, and while the previous systems that were being replaced were far from broken, it served, meaning the ERP system served as a catalyst for pretty significant transformative change that reached well beyond the technology itself. There was this unbelievable clear vision that was established around where we are going to be after ERP was implemented that I think everyone in the organization bought into before we took any steps in that direction. There were clear expectations around the outcomes we were expecting from it, which of course we got. We also clearly defined like how we were going to get there with very, very clear guiding principles, which I think sometimes we underestimate the importance of doing so. A lot of times we're very clear on the expected outcomes in terms of the goals we want, but not how we're going to get there. And we were very clear about that. Wild success, big scale across a big organization. So really a wonderful experience of, in many cases, maybe what to do.
Wow, that's a really impressive set of outcomes and a fab project. And I really love that idea of the guiding principles that you mentioned, and something to really inspire our listeners to consider making a tech change. Thanks very much for that. Let's move on to our second guest. Michelle Welsh is the Director of Digital Procurement in the Procurement Corporate Function at PPG. Michelle began her career in sales upon joining PPG in June 1991. She continued in a sales capacity until moving to Pittsburgh in July 2000 to become Business Manager, Chlorine. In February 2011, she assumed the role of Director, Logistics and Customer Service, Chemicals. She represented PPG as she advocated within the Chlorine Institute, the American Chemistry Council, and in Washington, D.C. to ensure the continued viability of safe, secure, and economic rail transportation. She held this role until October 2011 when she moved to Business Director, Teslin Substrate Products for the Specialty Coatings and Materials Strategic Business Unit of PPG. And in this role, she led the global team to achieve a global sales record. Excellent. Welcome to the webinar, Michelle.
Thanks, Helen. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
Michelle, I understand you're a big believer in conducting success blueprints. Where did that conviction come from?
Actually, I like the quote by Benjamin Franklin. He states, "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." And frankly, for me, a success blueprint or a pre-engineering is just really good sense. It's like preparing for a trip that you're going on. The plan really helps you get from point A to point B. It helps you identify, the actions needed, the order, the costs, and really you're thinking ahead so that you may uncover risks or surprises early so that you're not derailed on the trip.
That sounds like a really effective approach. Do you have an example for our listeners of a surprise you were able to identify from that forward planning, that Benjamin Franklin approach that you talked about, where you were able to identify something you needed to anticipate before you signed the contract?
Yes, and actually we're currently engaged in a global source to settle initiative across our organization. And we did a success blueprint in 2019 after we did about a year of various requests for information or requests for proposals and sourcing events, with a variety of suppliers in the space. Really, the blueprint that we undertook, which was a real 3 to 4 month effort, one of the big things that we found it early, which has been extremely helpful, is as we were going through the blueprint and validating the supplier that we thought we were going to choose, we really found that there were some gaps in the features that they had that would really derail our project. What we were able to do is identify those upfront, and actually we were able to include 4 feature requests in the contract so that that's already included from the supplier's perspective and our perspective before the project even got started.
Excellent. So a real benefit there from that forward planning and getting rid of those surprises before we start. Thanks very much for that example, Michelle. Thanks for sharing it. Finally, I'd like to welcome back to the recording hot seat Matt Stewart from Rise Now. And for those listeners that have not heard from Matt before, Matt's got a really impressive resume of experience of tech implementations. Here are the stats. Over 500 procure-to-pay, source-to-pay evaluations, over 200 implementations, and has been the top partner of multiple Gartner lead platforms over the course of the past 10 years. Now, Matt's the managing partner and founder of Rise Now, the supply management consultancy. And I'm glad I was sitting down when I read out those stats because they're really impressive. I feel quite exhausted just thinking about 500 procure-to-pay evaluations, but what a lot of experience there. And Matt, you're usually the one that likes to talk about the elephant in the room, all those tech implementation projects that fail. And while we're here today to talk about some wins, what should our listeners be wary about?
Thank you, Helen. Now, just to be clear, though, it's not that I like to talk about failure. I'd actually much rather talk about all of our successes and the successes of our clients. But I believe that if we're not transparent about our failures and what we could have done to avoid them, then many times history has a tendency to repeat itself. And based on our experience, we believe that success really starts early on, well before contracts are signed, and well before the project actually gets kicked off, as Michelle was just mentioning. So, I believe that trouble begins in the process that organizations typically go through to evaluate what technology is right for them. And we'll touch on some of that today. And first, there's just way too much focus on kind of what features and functions the technology offers. And we just don't see enough emphasis and focus on how that feature, how that function is actually going to be implemented. So you really need to go deeper than just a traditional RFP and demo to determine best fit for your organization. And you certainly don't want to underestimate the need, as Joe was just mentioning, for effective change management and to really help your end users embrace the change. And I just see way too many organizations decide they just don't need it, or they've got the wrong person leading it, and they end up tending to regret it.
you're quite right that we do need to learn from what's gone before. Matt, what are the consequences if things go wrong?
Well, from an organizational perspective, especially in an economic climate that we're in right now, it can mean the organization needs to look elsewhere to find cost savings that they were banking on with this project and the business case that was associated with this project. And unfortunately, that can mean additional layoffs or just layoffs just in general. And that's not something that that I know many of us want to see any more than what's necessary. But it doesn't stop there. You also have to look at the personal impact. Folks on projects that don't deliver results tend to stall their career. They don't get promoted, and even potentially they could lose their job because of this. So you definitely don't want your name associated with a failed project.
I suppose what I'd probably like to ask for you now is, what are you seeing for those teams that are actually achieving success then, just to finish on an up note?
Yeah, great question, Helen. At Rise Now, we've actually been tracking, the leaders of our projects and that we've worked with since 2015. And the great news is that the majority actually do get promoted, during or after our project due to the success and visibility of their tech implementation. Successful projects are career-making opportunities. And my hope that this webinar and our series, Major Tech Fails, will give some great insight into how to just do that. So this can be a career-making type opportunity for those that are involved, and a transformational type opportunity for these organizations that choose to take this path.
Well, thanks very much for that, Matt. Okay, listeners, we've heard about the great potential for positive outcomes for Joe and Michelle, and a word of caution from Matt. Let's get into the detail and discover how we can achieve that tech implementation win. Before we start down the road of a sourcing and implementation project for tech solution, we need to identify and perhaps make the case for change. Matt, let's stay with you for a minute. Some of our people that I've spoken to, when they're thinking about making a tech change, that they're perfectionists. They think they've got to get everything absolutely perfect before they start. Data housekeeping, a business process review, and they want to get all of that done and absolutely spot on before they move forward with the tech implementation. But then on the other hand, you've got the real sort of gung-ho optimists that think that tech's going to solve all the problems, that the AI is going to sort the data out, and they don't have to sort anything out at all. Two ends of the spectrum there. Which one is right, Matt? What do you think?
Well, it kind of depends, right? So for some organizations that have minimal complexity, they may be ready to jump right in. If you've got minimal complexity and you've got a pretty minimal IT landscape as far as the number of integrations and the processes and departments and users that are going to be impacted, you could certainly look to technology to help maybe get you there faster. But that's only if they've selected the right technology that's for their industry and for their particular organizational uniqueness. What we tend to see more often is organizations, that are struggling to keep their supplier data cleansed, or they've not looked at, or maybe have even over-engineered some of their processes and some of their policies, and they want to use this as an opportunity to get some of that cleaned up. And it'd be wise to take the time before you kick off a tech implementation to make some of those necessary changes, because you don't want to put unneeded pressure on your tech implementation team. They've already got enough on their plate, and you certainly don't want to be doing process reengineering and policy redesign and looking at a lot of things that were not really built to be inside the project plan of your implementation. So also understand that technology is an enabler, right? Which means it enables your people to be more efficient and more effective. And when you've got the right people in place following the right processes, that's when you can see the exponential gains in both efficiencies and in hard dollar savings. So just make sure you're not putting too much into your implementation plan and timeline that could in fact impact results.
Well, thanks for explaining that. I think that's given our listeners a really good feel for what might be involved and perhaps what part of the spectrum they're on in terms of what they might do pre-implementation. Joe, it'd be great to bring you in here with your experience of working with healthcare, and I'm sure that's got some great lessons that we can use in other industries and settings. When you assess the sophistication of the supply chain and the skill of their people, what do you see that makes you hesitant to recommend a tech solution to solve the problems?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And I'm going to kind of build on where Matt left off, saying tech is an enabler. And to say tech is an enabler implies that there must be something to enable. And so some of the lessons that we've learned in healthcare and even beyond healthcare, and I'll use a specific example to kind of tell the story, is that if there isn't a business process that exists with some level of consistency in how it's being done, and you then implement technology and hope that it's going to fill that gap, that's where we often see things fall down. And an example that we'll use is e-sourcing. E-sourcing is really, really phenomenal technology that in many ways has outpaced the business process of sourcing for many, many industries, healthcare being no exception. And so I use that as a very specific example in this case. Often, e-sourcing as a technology platform has been implemented with epic failure rates, despite brilliant technology, by the way, inside of supply chain functions, inside and outside of healthcare. And some of the reasons why it has actually kind of failed is because you can't really skip steps. You can't enable a process if the process isn't robust already, if the process isn't defined already. And so I might say it like this. First, you have to define why we want to do something different, like strategic sourcing in the first place. So if you're doing contracting today and not strategic sourcing, first you have to build the business case for doing something called strategic sourcing. Then you have to define, well, then what is strategic sourcing? What is the sourcing methodology and what is the business process that supports it? And then only then can you get into the how do I now do that work? And that's education and enabling tools. And it kind of has to be done in that order. And a lot of times we try to invert that entire pyramid and say, if I just give you a tool, e-sourcing, I'm going to assume you know how to do it through education that I'm giving you, which is technical education, but not really process education or skills-based education. And then you may not know how to do the sourcing methodology, and we may not have even built the business case for doing strategic sourcing, which means the compliance to the system and using the system is really low, and we think it's a system problem, and it's not. People still aren't even using strategic sourcing as a business process. And then we blame the system, right, for actually not being an effective implementation when the business process wasn't even in place to begin with. So, simply stated, if you don't have a process to re-engineer, standardize, and improve, and the talent to perform the work, then the tech can't solve the problem. There's no problem to be solved, right? You have to kind of back that up and actually do it in reverse.
Yep, and I think that's definitely something that I've seen in my experience in government procurement is that that thing you said about the business case, the why. If people don't understand why we're moving to a different way of sourcing and the strategic sourcing that you spoke about, then why would they use the system? They'll just go on with the old ways. So you've made a great point there about that the tech's not going to be that magic wand to improve anything. And if tech isn't the answer, then what do you recommend? I think you've talked us through that roadmap for strategic sourcing. Does that apply in other areas where tech's not the answer?
Yeah, so if maybe if tech isn't the answer, then what is the answer? And I would say tech is probably part of the answer. So let's say you're running a supply chain function, and this applies to any function that you might be running. It applies to if you're running HR, if you're running finance, if you're running an engineering department, and you're trying to figure out how do I become, effective and efficient at world-class levels. If you were just benchmarking your own function against world-class levels of performance. And if you were really trying to accomplish that, then you may want to pursue a more holistic, what I would call transformation. And transformation is not something that's just a phrase people throw around. There's an actual way to do it that includes, making sure you've got the right direction setting in place, the right strategy, the right alignment, the right org structure, the right culture that you're kind of creating within your own organization's culture. Of course, you need to have the right stakeholder engagement process. You need to have your business processes really, really well understood and well defined, which a lot of times we take for granted, but there's a lot of work to be done there. In the world of supply chain, there's got to be a way to engage your beyond stakeholders, like your suppliers very specifically, and there's a very intentional strategy around that. And then if those things, for those things to be successful, for you to be able to do those business processes, you need to have the supporting infrastructure underneath it. And infrastructure, or people, we always talk about as people, process, and technology, but I'm just, Helen, for the sake of the conversation, going to unpack that a little bit more. It's people and the talent management that needs to go with those people, probably most importantly. It's the processes, the policies, and the procedures. It's the data, the insights, and the technology, and it's the governance. And so, as you can see, yes, tech is part of it, but it's only a component of this entire approach to transformation. And so, of course, we need to have technology be part of our overall transformation strategy, but it probably isn't the tip of the spear. It's probably not the first thing we put in place. As an example, we wouldn't actually have technology precede strategy. We wouldn't have technology precede stakeholder engagement. We wouldn't have technology precede process definition. We wouldn't have technology precede our strategy around people, right? And having the right people on the bus to do the work, and having the right talent management, plan in place. We wouldn't have technology precede the right governance in place around how we make decisions and how we actually navigate, decisions in the organization internally and externally. So those are the types of things that are sequence to how this stuff gets done. And so technology is a component to it, but often we use it too often as the tip of the spear when it probably doesn't serve us very well in that order.
I mean, that's a great metaphor that you've brought in there, because the question I was going to ask you was about knowing when you're sort of ready to graduate from improving other things to implementing tech. But I think you've described for us. I've got it in my mind now about where tech is in that spear. We're talking about that transformation improvement spear, and it's obviously not at the front end. Is there anything you wanted to just add for our listeners before we move on from this point about when the point comes where you know that actually that's where you've got things in position that you can move to new tech? So you're past the policies and making the best of what you've got and getting all those bits in place, and now you're ready to do the new tech.
So Helen, the only thing I might add is I'm a big fan of, creating a distinction between incremental improvement and, revolutionary improvement. And so in likewise, right, there's technology that can help us kind of make incremental improvements, and we should have a technology roadmap in all of our functional areas that help us kind of anticipate, which technology we need, why we need it, what it is that we need, and when we're going to actually do it, so that we're not really surprised. Like, we should never kind of just wake up and say tomorrow, oh, we need e-sourcing because somebody showed us a demo of it. It should never happen that way. We should know precisely when we actually need e-sourcing, because we've identified either a user experience opportunity, an effectiveness improvement opportunity, an efficiency improvement opportunity, interoperability opportunity. There's some reason why we already know on our roadmap it's time for us to look at e-sourcing, and I'm just using that as an example of one of many. The other type of change is revolutionary. And sometimes often we got to keep our eyes open for technology that could fundamentally change the way we do what we do. And it's not going to be on our roadmap because we could have never imagined it in our roadmap 2 years ago, or even a year ago, or even 2 months ago. Blockchain, RPA are good examples of technology that fundamentally changes the way that we do what we do. And we almost then need to think about things in reverse and say, with this new way of new technology evolving, what are the applications that we could then anticipate, and how might we rethink and reimagine the entire function that we exist in, because the technology is so revolutionary. I think if we look at it through those two lenses, having a technology roadmap for incremental change that we're not surprised by and we're very planful with, and then keeping our eyes open for revolutionary technology, no head in the sand approach, so that we're then being super intentional about how we're changing things. That's I think the two triggers for how we really embrace new technology. Those become the trigger points.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Joe. And I think, you've given our listeners a great roadmap there to navigate through that decision-making process to make the change. Incremental versus revolution. Excellent. Okay, Michelle, I'd love to bring you in here as securing the resources for all that tech implementation is a critical step in the process. There's been a lot of talk during this crisis. Many business making their own determinations on what's essential and what isn't. Those projects that are not going to happen are going to be cut. And I was listening to a podcast recently with Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, who reported that he'd paused 70 out of 131 projects that they'd got underway in that business. And so obviously we're all now trying to make the case and compete for perhaps scarcer resources in the business. I'm curious, what advice can you give someone on the questions about how to position supply chain and supply chain tech systems as being essential to their organization so they can get that investment?
Helen, that's an excellent question. And frankly, we've all been in unprecedented times. There's a lot of change and rethinking. I would say, or offering advice, since our project that I'm currently leading was deemed as one of the essential projects to continue in our organization. And I think we've paused more than 70 from that perspective. But I really think that from a supply chain perspective, there's a lot of talk about our customers. So customers, frankly, are the heart or the lifeblood of any business. That's frankly, we're here to service them, to keep them operating, and to help them really be successful. There's been a lot of challenging times as different customers and manufacturers and businesses have had to pause their organizations or their operations because of the pandemic, and now they're looking to get back and restart in this new normal. I think from a supply chain perspective, the key thing to think about is if our customers are the heart or the lifeblood, really the supply chain is the vessels and arteries that's really getting the blood and helping the customers survive and excel. And as we look at internally, as our CEO has said, that we're moving now from the defensive position to the offensive position, we really need to make our customers successful and make them more successful in this new normal. So we need to look at efficiency, reducing complexity, using technology and our resources better. And that's really the sweet spot where supply chain and supply chain implementations really start to kick in. And frankly, the determination of keeping our project as essential to our corporation was decided by our top management because they need and want, first of all, the savings that we're going to deliver to the corporation, but also that efficiency and new processes that we'll be able to deliver to be even more nimble and flexible in helping our customers.
Excellent. So moving from the defensive to the offensive, I like that, and really getting in there and demonstrating that the tech that's going to enable the supply chain is going to give us the savings and efficiency that we need. Is there anything else that you would suggest to our listeners that they can do to secure the support and buy-in from your CEO and the C-suite? You mentioned efficiencies, but is there anything else that can reassure them that this tech investment is going to reap the dividends that we're talking about?
So yeah, Helen, that's a great question. And I think that as I look at how you get support and buy-in from the CEO and C-suite, it goes back to where you and I started in this conversation is have a good plan. A good plan tells about the what, the why, the when, and the how. We had done our homework up front, and we had already gotten the support and buy-in of the CEO and C-suite because they really believed that we had determined a great business case, which meant that we were going to give them a return on their investment, provide a payback and savings, but also we had demonstrated that we knew how we were going to get to that. And frankly, right now, what the C-suite and others are looking for is they need those savings in these challenging times. So the value that we could bring still is helping the project be essential to the organization and really to moving forward. So it really starts at the beginning with having a good plan.
And were there any questions that they raised that you can share with our listeners? What got their attention What got them interested? How did they sort of probe you a little bit when you were up there making the presentation for the resources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they definitely had questions, as I would have expected. The great part is when I was selling them on our idea with using all of the great details and benefits of our success blueprint, really having that solid and complete plan made it, frankly, easy, if asking for lots and lots of money can ever be easy. I recall specifically that there were a few questions in particular, do you really think that you could do this faster or quicker? And I was able to answer that question, as well as really all the other questions, by saying, we thought about that, or we examined that option or analysis, and really was able to, in the case of asking if we could do the project, faster, quicker, or better, was able really to give them or walk them through how we looked at that, what the pros and cons were, why we arrived at the time frame that we did, and that frankly, we and what we were presenting at that time as a result of months of a blueprint really was the best position for the project and for the corporation really to be successful. So the fact that we were able to anticipate and answer those questions gave us also some credibility and some belief that we did know what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. And this really combined to get their attention.
Sounds like you were really well prepared when you went in then. And I assume that meant that you'd got great backing from your CEO. What type of impact does that have when you've got that senior leadership support?
Frankly, the senior leadership support is frankly invaluable. First of all, what some of that support has given us is the organization hears about the project and hears from the leaders how this project or tech implementation really contributes to the organization's vision and mission. So, the organization sees the importance and value, and that this isn't just another implementation. It's frankly an implementation that really aligns and is going to take the corporation on that next step in their vision. So what we found is when we call on people in the organization because we need the users, whether it's to get their input on design or in our upcoming testing, many of them can say, oh, I've heard about that, or I've heard that this is important. So it kind of greases the skids, if you will, and allows us to have credibility and ask for their help. The other thing that's been really fascinating is that C-suite support has been so impactful to the project team. It has been very motivating in the fact that the project team also knows that what they're working on and what we're working to be successful on has an impact on the corporation, and that they truly are working on a project that has visibility and value for the corporation. We went so far as to have our C-suite visit with the team on a pretty regular basis in those times when we were able to be together. And also we have one of our senior vice presidents who every month sends a note to the entire organization on our behalf, and she's also recorded videos for the project team. So that combination of support really has been motivating and enabling for the team as well as for the organization.
That's absolutely, what a fabulous example. And I think, being able to connect your sort of tech implementation in the procurement supply chain space to the corporate vision and the way forward must be just so uplifting for your team. Thanks for that, Michelle. Now, Joe, I'm thinking that many people might be also looking at this and saying, oh, you know what, I'd really love to replace my tech. I think I can get my CEO on board, but I just haven't got any cash kicking around. There's budget cuts, there's resources cuts going on, and I'm stuck. Any final words of wisdom from you that you would share with our listeners before we move on from this section to help them make sure that they don't just have to settle for sticking with the old tech?
I really honor what Michelle said about moving from defense to offense. I think supply chain should be playing that role in general, not only with tech, but we'll keep it in the tech context for right now. And imagine if you were to reverse engineer the approval process for how technology investments are actually, how those decisions are actually made. And if you knew what matters to the organization most, and even currently, what they're actually evaluating. Like, for example, are they prioritizing user experience today because internal customer service matters more today than it did yesterday? Are they prioritizing, right, the efficiency, the cost to actually perform your own internal service? Or are they prioritizing what you're actually delivering, your effectiveness? Are they prioritizing interoperability? Because sometimes I think we, build a business case and it hits the wrong target. Bullseye, but wrong target. And so really understanding kind of what matters to the organization at that time so you can build the case the right way is really wildly important. Like, as an example, if you're in a supply chain function today and not leveraging the COVID response and the broken supply chain that's resulted from COVID, to say we need a more reliable supply chain so that we never end up in a situation like we just did, that would be a mistake, because there's not a hospital supply chain C-suite executive that isn't now worried about that, probably more than the cost to perform the supply chain service. Reliability matters at least as much, as an example. And to actually not lean on that would be a mistake in building the business case. And again, building the coalition in the language of the stakeholders, the what's in it for them, and making sure you're not walking in to get that business case approved without, cold. I mean, this is like, how do you actually go and influence every single one of those people before you even got into the vote? And I know this is how this stuff happens. It happens in capital committees, especially in healthcare. And so I would never walk into one of those conversations or suggest somebody do it without having every person around the table already on board. And the last thing I might say, Helen, is that I think supply chain, frankly, has one of the easiest business cases of all to get investments, even at a time that we're facing right now where there's budget crunches, because supply chain is one of the only functions that can actually provide extended benefits beyond just their own cost to serve, right? So a lot of times a technology business case might look like, I can do more of what I'm doing for lower dollars. Imagine an accounting department or a payroll department, which is a true cost center. Supply chain is not a cost center like that. A supply chain delivers, on average, about a 10-to-1 return on investment for every dollar invested, if it actually manages its dollars appropriately. There's very, very few functions that actually have that kind of return on investment. So the technology investments that it is asking for applies, that same ratio should be applying. I mean, every dollar you put into it, it's not that I'm going to save you by taking resources out of supply chain, but I'm going to deliver back to you, whether it's cost savings through sourcing, or whether it's supply chain resilience and logistics, but I'm going to give you back dollars for every dollar that you give me. And there are very few functions inside any organization that have that type of value proposition. And my take on it is I think supply chain plays too small and doesn't lean into its strategic potential often enough to actually play that card. And it actually plays by the old rules, which is, I'm asking for X number of dollars and I'll take out X number of people as a result of it. And I don't think supply chain needs to relegate itself to that conversation.
Well, thanks very much for that. I think that both of you have really put a smile on my face. It's time for optimism about getting those resources, and that idea of the 10-to-1 return on investment. It's a great way to end that section. Thanks very much to Michelle and to Joe for those points. Okay, let's move on then to the procurement process itself. At the beginning of any tech project, it's important to decide what stakeholders we need to get on board. Matt, I know at Rise Now you're involved in supporting clients through that process. How do you go about it, and who are the key people we need to have involved?
Yeah. So Helen, if your tech project is something like a sourcing solution, then you really only need a head of sourcing and a sourcing team to buy in internally and be involved. And then your suppliers obviously externally need to be involved on a event by event type basis, because you have so few users of the platform and it's really kind of self-contained in the sourcing department. But once you get into like procurement, accounts payable, and you're getting into supplier collaboration and other different components, it starts to affect and starts to touch other parts of the organization, other departments, and even it can be used across many different countries as well. So the higher we suggest you go in the organization for executive sponsorship, the better it's going to be to get buy-in, especially if you've got, like I said, many different departments, countries, and operating companies that are involved. So for us, we shoot for the CEO, if at all possible, for many of the reasons that Michelle mentioned earlier. Because when you got the CEO on board with your project and they're engaged, it's so much easier to get engagement internally and externally with your suppliers. And in terms of the approach and the process that we do to make this happen and make sure that you've got all the necessary parties involved in your project, we've got a proven process that we follow that Michelle was mentioning earlier, that we walked Michelle and PPG through, called a Success Blueprint. And we'll go in greater detail on that process. And we also, we've also gone through pretty extensively on our Major Tech Fails podcast.
Excellent, yeah, Matt, and thanks for referring to that. Now, listeners obviously can find those episodes over on Procurious. Joe, as a supply chain leader, you're probably most known for the impact that you make in the people that you work with. And as we look at people, process, and technology, I'm sure you would say that people are the most important of the three. Am I right?
Yes, very, very short response here. And it's very easy to kind of say it this way. Without people, there is no process. Without people, there is no technology that gets built or used. Without people, there are no warehouses. I mean, all the things that we kind of consider to be assets of the company, even if we're a manufacturer and we make something, right, and the production line, without the people, there's no production. And so if we don't actually kind of just remember that we are all in the business of people leadership, then I think we kind of miss the real opportunity.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. And so if people are at the top of our list, which they quite rightly should be, give an example from your experience of how you can actually get those internal stakeholders involved in the tech implementation process.
Yeah, I'll give a different example from ERP, although that was a good one. I'm going to use one that's more narrow and maybe deep. I'll go back to Intermountain Healthcare though, because this was an area that was very difficult for us to get some traction with initially. We tried doing it through process alone, and we didn't get there. It was actually through people that we got there, and then ultimately got technology as a byproduct. And we were trying to improve utilization management in some of our clinical service areas. And so for those of you that are not in healthcare, some of the biggest challenges that healthcare faces is we negotiate prices with suppliers over and over and over again, but the bigger opportunity is by standardizing what we use in terms of the products in each procedural area. And then even more importantly, are we actually consuming and using the right quantities of products and even the right products in the right procedures? And there's way more opportunity in utilization management than there is in standardization and even price negotiation. I mean, if you can actually not use a product because it's unnecessary and you save 100%, that's way easier than saving 5% through a price negotiation, just as an example. So really important area, really complex. And so how do we engage stakeholders is a really, really important question. The team actually started by building a tool, of course, because that's what happens. And ultimately, it didn't take off because the tool wasn't really the root cause. What the secret sauce was the people engagement process. There was this massive collaboration between clinical integration and supply chain. So the clinical integration team or clinical leadership team, think about CMO, the chief medical officer, chief nursing officer, and that leadership team and supply chain got together and built cohorts of surgeons, folks from the operating rooms, and then the operators of each facility, and they organized them in cohorts by facility, by procedure. And then what we started to do was to start to show them data with full transparency to say, in this procedural area, here's the raw data by surgeon, by facility, by procedure. And then we started to just plant questions with them to just activate their curiosity. We did not give them goals. We did not give them expectations because we didn't want to constrain them or put them into what would feel like a cul-de-sac. Now, what we leaned on was that physicians are scientists. They're very, very data-driven. Physicians are also cooperatively competitive with each other. So once we started showing them data and just ranking with names, the surgeons in different areas, we weren't even saying it was good or bad. We were just literally showing them the raw data. It was something really fascinating started to take place. We said with some curiosity-based questions, what do you think about this? What conclusions might you draw from this? What might be the root causes of these sources of variation? Then the surgeons started to come back and say, well, there doesn't seem to be a different outcome, even though there's massive variation in how we're performing this procedure. I wonder if there's value in us actually standardizing in this case or not using as many different products. So we ended up getting these byproducts of massive standardization. We rationalized so much utilization that was unnecessary. Intermountain saved about $90 million by doing this and built a very, very elaborate tool to do this. And when they commercialized this business, which is now a standalone business, which I'm not trying to give an advertisement for, but it shows you kind of the potential. It's a company that's now called Empiric. It helps, I think it helps everyone understand, I think, the value of it's not about the tool. The tool is very, very slick, and it does some extraordinary things to connect outcomes, in some very insightful ways that help hospitals really understand whether or not they're actually standardizing care and standardizing, practice and standardizing the supplies they use as well. It does that, but it wouldn't be effective without all the engagement models and the cohort model of the people engagement model that's actually underneath it. And even Empiric would say that today. That's the foundation of what makes that a different offering. So that's probably one of the better examples I have of us trying to do technology first, adjusting and making it all about the people and stakeholder engagement. And then, of course, then the technology took off.
Fantastic. That's an excellent example and really shows us what the potential is if we get those stakeholders involved. Great advice there from Matt and Joe about the people that we need to get involved and on board to make our tech implementation a success, and some great examples as well. Okay, let's turn to the all-important sourcing and selection process in our new tech. Matt, we've decided we're going for that transformation piece. We're probably going to start out with a vision of utopia, that there's a solution that fits our organization and it's perfect and it's going to address all the compromises that we're living with just now. How did we go about determining the needs that we actually want to put in the RFP? Because, perhaps utopia isn't something we're going to specify and we need to dial down a bit.
Right. Well, the first thing we do is we conduct workshops with key user populations, key stakeholders throughout our client's organization. Those departments, operating companies, user populations that have unique requirements, they really need to be heard. And the sooner that they can be heard and the earlier in the process, the better. So we do this a little bit different, though, than what we see a lot of organizations go through, because we see a lot of organizations kind of build a wish list, like you said, kind of that utopia, of all the different requirements, and they prioritize and then assign a score to each of the different requirements and then load it up into an RFP. What we like to do is instead focus on the actual user stories, the actual user experience, the use cases, and the process flows, that the technology is going to have to be able to enable. And then based on our experience with implementing all the different solutions in this space, we put a spotlight on those use cases that may actually cause a challenge, may be a gap. And then we use those user stories, use cases, build out the demo scripts for the vendors to use so that they can then score and compare the different solution providers. This helps to put the focus and the attention on what really matters. Because if you think about it, any of the different solutions out there today, they can show you how they can requisition a laptop. But the key is, how are they going to address some of your most challenging use cases that will negatively impact adoption if they're not effectively addressed inside the solution?
And do we have to make any trade-offs on the way, Matt?
Trade-offs, maybe, but you've got some options. So, if first kind of have to decide on the best course of action. So, typically the best option is to re-engineer your existing process. So if the solution can't enable the different process and use case, you can certainly look to re-engineer. And a lot of times we'll look to do that during our blueprinting process, because again, a lot of stress to do that during the implementation. So this option, those can be difficult, depending upon your organization's appetite for change, and does require some process redesigning and does require some extra change management. So you got to make sure you've got some strong change management resources in place. Another option is to look to see if there's an acceptable workaround. What if other organizations, talk to your implementation team, talk to your implementation provider and your software company. What other solutions have other organizations come up with in how to address this inside of the platform without having to write new code? Last resort, which does take time, but is something certainly that can be addressed, is you may need to go to the software vendor and add a feature request. Ideally, if you can get those isolated and identified prior to going with the contract, going with that vendor, you can get maybe more commitment and understanding as far as when that software, when in the roadmap, when in that timeline, will the solution actually become available. All these different solutions, you might have some associated pain with them, but if you can identify and plan for it, you can certainly implement successfully. And what we find, it's when it's a surprise during the implementation is where we see the most issues.
Okay, that's great. Just to think about all that detail that we've got to cover there. Michelle, we've done all that work that Matt's described. I'd like to bring you in now as we move on to that all-important stage where we're having to make the decision. And we've got those tech providers in front of us. They're doing a demo, and they're probably coming up with a little bit of sales speak. It would be great if you could share some of the sales speak that you've heard during the sales process, that your sales blueprint perhaps exposed.
The one that I'd like to speak about is the sales speak that integration is easy. So we heard that as we were going through our process, and I guess it gave us a moment of pause. Because as we look at our corporation, we have many ERP systems. So we knew that the integrations were going to be many and likely complex. So when we heard the sales speak that it was easy, that's really where we said we really need to stop and think about this. And as we entered into the blueprint with Matt and the team at Rise Now, we had about 10 deliverables, but the main deliverable was really to figure out what the scope of the integrations would be. Would we include the over 30 ERPs that we have, or would we limit it to the 10 major ERPs? So that was a key consideration. But then really to figure out what integrations would look like, we really had to look at the how, which was a key part of the success blueprint. Each of the different tech providers really had actually different ways to integrate with their system, and they were very unique in that there was really no two tech providers that had the same integration strategy or platform. So that became very apparent during the success blueprint. And what we did as part of the blueprint, which many people wait till after the project and in the design, we actually decided that we would scope 10 ERPs. And we actually had sessions with people from each ERP to talk about what integrations would be needed, how would the data flow, and even have the ERPs estimate what time and development it would take to make those integrations, so that when we got to the business case, I was able to confidently say, for each of our ERPs, we're going to require 10 integrations with the tech provider, and we've included that development time in our business case. So that's really why and how we were able to dispel the sales speak and move it to actions as part of doing the success blueprint. And actually, at this point, I still have my fingers crossed. We're early in the project, but so far we haven't had any surprises with the integrations that we scoped as part of the business blueprint. Hopefully, I'm not jinxing myself.
Excellent, and I think you've covered there, all the pitfalls and the ways you negotiated that. Anything you think you wouldn't be where you are now if you had have believed some of the salespeople along the way? Any more points?
Well, but we actually may have chosen a different provider, which could have had surprises.
That's actually a big point, isn't it?
Yeah, that is. The other great part out of this is since we involved the ERPs and the resources early on, in even the decision phase, they're more engaged, less surprised, and feel that they had a say versus us, shoving a technical platform down their throat.
Okay, that's fantastic. What a great point. And I think as time's moving on in the webinar now, for our listeners, I think I'm going to just move us forward then. We've talked a lot about the sales blueprint, the success blueprint, of all that planning and preparation we come to, and it's a really comprehensive way to look at things and manage those senior stakeholder expectations, Matt. Now, I know many would rather take a cautious approach and not look at the upside, and I guess that falls back on us to show that we're intending to mitigate that risk when people are getting pessimistic and asking those what-if questions. How do we go about that, Matt? Are there times when some risk is inevitable, but how do we frame that up to the senior stakeholders when they say, well, you've got this plan, you've done this sourcing, but I still think there might be some risks around this. How would you go about framing that up?
Yeah, Helen, another component of the process that we undertake with our clients is a fit gap analysis to eliminate any potential surprises that might arise during implementation. And we capture those potential areas that would normally be surprises during implementation, and we really put a spotlight on them early on, as Michelle was just mentioning. That way, we can mitigate any project risk and identify the potential solutions early on. It also gives us more time to deal with them when we uncover them prior to kicking the project off, because you can weigh your options, have time to decide on what the best course of action is. In almost all cases, if we can identify and plan for these gaps prior to kicking off the implementation, then we can implement successfully, build it into the project plan, and understand how long it's going to take, because again, there's no surprise. But it's when a surprise is identified during the implementation, that's where we see the most issues. That's where you see change orders, that's where you see cost overruns, and that's where you see your definition of success many times not being achieved.
Okay, and Michelle gave us a great example there of a cautionary tale of surprises that would come out if you didn't do that, and her big one there was about choosing a different system. So thanks to Michelle, and thank you to Matt for that. Okay, we're nearly at the end now. Let's think about that final piece, which is getting that return on the investment and implementation. I'd like to focus on two important and linked issues that we need to get to now to make sure our CEO is happy with the tech implementation ROI. What are the key things, Matt, our listeners need to bear in mind as it relates to creating and presenting their business case?
Yeah, so early in my career, I had clients that kind of took a one-size-fits-all approach to building out their business case, and they'd go to their CFO, CEO, board level approval, and they'd be asked a lot of questions about how certain numbers were calculated and be caught by surprise. And you see, they're using that kind of one-size-fits-all type approach, and it was a templated type business case spreadsheet, and it was using some algorithm that they couldn't explain, and so some formula that was derived, and the CFO would shoot some holes in the numbers, and they'd come out of that with a long list of questions that they needed answered. Certainly not the story that Michelle talked about earlier, as she walked in to have this, the questions that were coming before and the questions that happened. She's had already thought through and already knew she owned her numbers. She owned what She had already thought through all the different scenarios and all the different questions, and she truly knew her numbers going into that presentation. But for some, they're kind of it's their only shot at getting their project approved, and they really kind of miss that opportunity if they're not able to answer effectively those questions. And for others, they might get another shot, but as Michelle mentioned, there could be a kind of a cloud of doubt over the project because if you don't have command of the detail, your CFO is now wondering, do I have the right team in place to actually execute upon this vision? And can they be trusted with the details of a project of this magnitude? So, I've seen, CFOs pour into a spreadsheet that, created the numbers and discover that a one-size-fits-all approach was used, which means kind of a blanket savings percentage was spread across all categories and including categories of spend that maybe shouldn't even have been included. And so in front of your CFO is not the time to come to this realization. So we believe it's best to take a little extra time, do it right the first time, build out the business case, as you never know how many times you're going to have a chance to present in front of your CFO. And you certainly want that time to be a memorable one when done right. And it's a great way to advance your career when you do.
Yep, absolutely. And Michelle, just a small point just to add on to that then, about total cost of ownership, because it's perhaps something that we perhaps don't do justice when we're thinking about business case. What have you found in terms of that and presenting that full picture of what it's going to cost to implement and run the systems that you've purchased?
Yeah, total cost of ownership has to be the broad measure that you look at. As Matt mentioned, we did have our numbers going into our presentation, and that was obviously the preparation we got out of the success blueprint we did with Rise Now. But really, if we hadn't, we would have sold the project short. We would have used the template that looked at, resources and license. But frankly, the project is the ongoing implementation of the software and the adoption needed by the users to actually generate the sales. So when you extend to looking at total cost of ownership, you start thinking about, training costs to get to that adoption. Once you go live and have implemented the software, you also are looking at the ongoing support and new feature requests that you may need and the costs of those to continue the adoption, to deliver the savings, and frankly, the supplier network, because we have our customers, we have our users, but the suppliers are also a key part of this. So if you're only focusing on the template and the project, you're going to really sell yourself short and not be able to likely implement the savings that the project has committed to.
Well, thanks very much. And I think extending that lens out to look at the longer term costs and that focus on ROI, has taken us right back to the start of the webinar, and it's great outcomes and great benefits that we can realize for our organizations from that tech when we get our tech implementation right that comes out from that phase. So let's finish up then with asking our three guests for their final words of wisdom. Joe, what's your one tip for success for our listeners to get a successful tech implementation?
Yeah, probably that I'll focus on the change leadership, and maybe just will adapt a quote that we've often used, that change leadership eats technology solutions for breakfast. That without the change leadership, you cannot have an effective technology implementation. And so the one tip I would put into that bucket, because there's many elements of change leadership, I'll just focus on communication, right? If you're going to take one step, is to remember the 10 by 10 by 10 rule. And that is, in order for someone to retain something and people even 10%, you need to say something 10 times in 10 different ways for them to receive it and even understand it 10%. And I always remember that, Helen, as it's a constant reminder for me to not assume that I've said it once so everyone understands it. It's to constantly communicate over and over and over. And it's probably one of the more fundamental elements of change leadership that I think we underestimate, especially when we're actually embracing something as culture changing and as transformative as a technology implementation can be.
Excellent. Get that, eating that tech implementation for breakfast with your change leadership. I love that. Okay, Michelle, what piece of wisdom have you got for our listeners today to end with?
Yeah, and we touched on many of these, but I have said that I will never do another project, assuming that I will have other great opportunities to lead a large project. I will always do a blueprint or a pre-engineering. It just was so enlightening and so helpful and really opened our eyes that I can't imagine not doing that planning for any project going forward.
And really linking back to your lovely quote at the beginning from Benjamin Franklin about fail to prepare is preparing to fail. So excellent. Use that pre-engineering and that prep. Okay, finally then, Matt, let's hear from you. Let's close the webinar with your key takeaway for our listeners to use.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me, Helen. So for me, I kind of close with this. Times of crisis create opportunities for those that go looking for them, right? Organizations that I see use this time to invest in their people, invest in their processes, invest in their technology, assess their governance, reinventing themselves in the hearts and minds of their organization, their vendors, their partners, I see will succeed and separate themselves amongst their peers. And we've really seen this play out. This is now, from an organizational standpoint, our executive team's third major recession that we're helping navigate our clients through. And we're already starting to see a new breed of supply chain leaders emerge during this recession. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what kind of leader do you want to be? The one that sees opportunity and capitalizes on it, or the one that can't see past the challenges that today brings? And I encourage you to be the former and see what is the next step that you can take and set your goals and be chasing after those goals. There's never been a greater time for supply chain leaders to make a positive impact in their organizations than what I see today.
Wow, that's fantastic. And what great insights for our listeners, and what a great way to end the webinar today. Thanks very much to our panel, Joe Walsh, Michelle Welsh, and Matt Stewart from RiseNow for their contributions today. If you'd like to listen to this webinar again or share it with your peers, we'll be making the on-demand available on Procurious from tomorrow. And if you want to explore what's possible using these capabilities, why not head on over to Procurious at procurious.com, ask a question on our discussion forum to keep the debate going. Thank you